Good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Murray and I work for the Risk Management Implementation Unit here at ECHA. Last year's webinar on Downstream users updated you on recent developments to help you fulfill your duties under the REACH regulation. This year we want to focus on a new tool you have available on ECHA's website, the use maps. Use maps provide a harmonised and structured way of describing how downstream users use chemicals. When registrants base their chemical safety assessment on information from downstream users, this helps to ensure that the advice downstream users receive in safety data sheets is directly applicable and that handling exposure scenarios is easier. This will improve the safe use of chemicals. Today's agenda should be visible on your screens. During the webinar, you will be guided through the use maps format and learn how the concept works in practice. We will start with a presentation on the benefits of using the use maps. After this, my colleague Mercedes Vinyas will explain to you how use maps are generated. She will be followed by my colleague Bridget Ginnity, who will tell you how registrants can select use maps and how use maps and KSAR are interconnected, or where to find them on ECHA's website, among other things. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time through the question and answer panel, which should be visible in your webinar window. If you want to focus on the presentations, you can also send us questions during the 30 minutes following the end of the event. Our panelists will answer as many of them as possible directly through the question and answer panel. Please try to submit questions related to the webinar topics and do not include any confidential business information. If your question is not answered by the end of the webinar, you can send it to us using our contact form. If you wish to ask something more specific, or if your question contains confidential business information, you can send them also using our contact form. If you experience any difficulties with the webinar tool, you can contact our technical support team through the question and answer panel or by email. The information is visible on your screens. So, let's move on to our first topic, where I will explain to you how you can benefit from using the use maps. In this presentation, I will cover the following topics. First, a short explanation on the use maps concept. Then, a vision on how information in the supply chain can work. After that, I shall give an overview of use maps, their purpose, and how they contribute to effective supply chain communication. Then, I shall talk about the important role of sector organisations in this work. Finally, we'll learn about some of the benefits that use maps can bring to downstream users and registrants alike. Before we start, let's say a few words on the concepts of use maps. The concept consists of both a format and a process to facilitate the communication of information on uses and conditions of use up the supply chain. As a format, the use maps contain the description of the typical uses and the conditions of use of a sector in an agreed harmonised format. Use maps are not designed to be substance specific and do not list names of substances. Rather, they describe uses such as activities or processes for which several substances may be used. In terms of the process, use maps are preferably developed by downstream user sector organisations in collaboration with their members and are then made available to registrants. industry has realised the value of this concept since 2009. The more recent work that you'll learn about today, undertaken with industry stakeholders, has reviewed the concept to upgrade it based upon lessons learnt from past experience and to align it with developments elsewhere, for example, with rich IT-related tools and the need for better quality information on use and exposure in registration dossiers for various purposes. In practice, the concept offers an efficient and effective option to inform registrants about the uses of substances in a sector. So, let's look at how the chemical supply chain and how the flow of information on safe use of substances under the REACH regulation works. We can think of the information flow as a loop between two main actors, the manufacturers and importers who place substances on the market, and the downstream users. For this presentation, we concentrate on two types of downstream user: end users, those companies that purchase substances to use directly in their processes or activities. They might also produce articles. And formulators, those companies that mix substances together to produce mixtures. The mixtures are then supplied to their customers, who might be other end users, retailers, or even consumers. You'll notice from this slide that formulators appear in both the up and down directions of the supply chain. Formulators have a key role to play in the communication flow in the supply chain and the preparation of use maps. We'll return to this role in a moment. So, who prepares and provides which information in the supply chain? The registrant of a substance is obliged to prepare the registration dossier, and for substances that are manufactured or imported in 10 tonnes or more per year, this includes the chemical safety report. The registrant is required to assess the use of the substance throughout its life cycle. Therefore, as a first step, he needs to gather information on the uses of his substance in the supply chain, for example, from his downstream customers. The registration dossier and the chemical safety report document conditions of safe use. Exposure scenarios describe the conditions of safe use for specific uses or groups of uses. The chemical safety report is submitted to ECHA, while the safety data sheet, which should contain information which is consistent with the chemical safety report, is the vehicle to communicate information on safe use to customers. Safety data sheets may have exposure scenarios attached to them. These exposure scenarios for communication should concentrate on describing in a clear manner the operational conditions and risk management measures which result in the safe use of that substance. The use of standard phrases is recommended for exposure scenarios. Now let's look in more detail at communicating information on uses and the conditions of use of substances between the various actors. Let's take a closer look at the left-hand side of this illustration, the upstream communication. A message here is that information to suppliers results in better information or better advice on the safe use from the supplier. Downstream users have the right to inform a registrant about their uses of a substance in order to have them included in the registrant's chemical safety report. Use maps are one means by which a formulator can provide structured information on the substances they use in their mixtures. The information flow is most efficiently managed by sector associations, and several are developing use maps to cover typical uses and conditions of use in their sector. When there is a need to inform a registrant about your own use directly, harmonised templates should be used in order to standardise the communication flow. Use maps can still help to do this. Use maps contain information that helps to describe the uses of substances and mixtures and the conditions on which they are used, that is, the operational conditions and the risk management measures. These conditions form an important data input set for the registrant's exposure assessment for a substance. In a use map, harmonised templates are available to document these conditions of use for consumers, the environment and workers. These are commonly abbreviated as SCEDs, SPERCs and SWEDs respectively. Tools like ECHA's Chemical Safety Assessment and Reporting Tool KSAR are being further developed to import and process the information contained in a use map. Clear, realistic descriptions of use and conditions of use are essential ingredients for the registrant's registration dossier, not least for describing safe use of their substances to different audiences. Information from the registration dossier is used to inform the public generally about chemicals in the European marketplace through ECHA's dissemination portal. ECHA and member state authorities scrutinise the registration dossiers to verify the correctness of the information and screen them to identify substances where further regulatory risk management may be required at European level. Such risk management includes the restriction of substances or the granting of authorised uses. The information is used by registrants to inform their customers how to use their substances safely. This brings us to the information flow shown on the right-hand side of this illustration. Information drawn from use maps can help to provide meaningful and realistic information to a downstream user via the safety data sheet and the exposure scenario. So, in the next slide, let's remind ourselves on what use maps are. Use maps are developed by sector associations, normally downstream user sectors. They describe uses and conditions of use. They provide data that can be readily processed for registration using IT tools. They have a format comprised of two essential parts: a part that serves to describe the uses and the input elements for the REACH exposure assessment. For workers, these are known as sector-specific worker exposure descriptions. For the environment, specific environmental release categories. And for consumers, specific consumer exposure determinants. Let's now consider the important role that sector organisations play in the generation of and communication about use maps. Many sector organisations exist that cover the main actors in the chemical supply chain: manufacturers of substances, the formulators of mixtures, and the end users of substances and mixtures. In the generation and communication of use maps, sector organisations play an important role. They can identify and pool together the expertise needed from their member companies for the benefit of their whole membership. They can support the work on sector use maps by putting in place systems to collect information, for example through questionnaires. They can also support companies with resources and the coordination of activities, for example through setting up a working group. Drafting and publishing sector-specific guidance that explains their approach about use maps, for example to suppliers. Helping to communicate centrally with member companies and with registrants or sector associations who represent registrants. They can also liaise with the authorities. Sector organisations representing formulators play a vital role in preparing and communicating the relevant information in an understandable way. They occupy a key position in both the upstream and downstream communication flows of use and conditions of use, in particular through their knowledge of the use and conditions of use of the mixtures they supply to their customers. So, investing effort in sector use maps can bring many benefits. For a registrant, they provide structured information on use and conditions of use for your chemical safety assessment, chemical safety report, exposure scenarios, and safety data sheets. Use maps can help to avoid the over-reporting of uses, or indeed missing important uses. They help to provide clear, relevant, and more realistic information on conditions of use for downstream formulators and end users, allowing to greater consistency in the information provided to those customers by reducing the variability in how conditions of use are communicated to them, for example via extended safety data sheets. This can help to avoid the experience so far indicated by formulators of receiving different information from different suppliers, in particular in the formats utilised to convey information on the safe use of a substance, the uses of a substance, concentrations, and risk management advice. Being based on information provided by downstream sectors, use maps can also promote good practice and realistic advice on safe use of chemicals across different sectors and markets. So, let's find out what industry itself has to say about use maps.
Well, to start the story, when we were working at our registrations dossiers in 2008, we found out that there was a lack of information on how our chemicals were used in the market. We have trying to find this information, but apparently from what we learned after the registrations in 2010, 2013, we were confronted with criticism from downstream users that they were not finding back their uses in our registration dossiers, in our safety data sheets and the exposure scenarios, and there was hence a kind of mismatch between what we thought was a good effort and how it was seen by the downstream users. In order to solve this problem, we have been exploring much more on how we can look now at this extended use maps in order to combine the two obligations that we have, we as manufacturers, to describe the uses, and downstream users to end up that they recognize easily that their use is covered in our registration dossiers. So these use maps are in fact creating a kind of win-win situation in which there are clearly profits and benefits for the manufacturers of substances as well as downstream users of these substances.
Downstream users should really benefit of the existing templates. They should make use of them, populate them as soon as possible, because registrants are really now rushing towards the 2018 deadline, and thus downstream users may make sure that their uses are really covered.
So, I'm coming to the end of my presentation on use maps and their benefits. Before ending, I'd like to summarise what you've heard. Firstly, use maps provide clear, relevant and realistic communication on uses and conditions of use for registrants and downstream users alike. Second, the quality of information in the supply chain relies heavily on the exchange of information between downstream user and the registrant. What goes up comes down. It pays to provide your supplier with comprehensive information on how you use substances. Thirdly, harmonised templates and guidance that explain what you need to do are available to help you. Finally, start now. Contact your sector association to find out if they have a use map that you can take advantage of, or if they intend to prepare one. It is important to act as soon as possible if any of the substances you use are likely to be registered by your suppliers by the next REACH registration deadline of the 31st of May 2018. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found the presentation useful. I now give the floor to my colleague Mercedes Viñas, who will talk about the description of structure and format of use maps. Mercedes, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, my name is Mercedes Viñas and I work in the Registration Directorate here in ECHA. My presentation today is about how use maps are generated. You have heard from my colleagues in the previous presentations that use maps are to be generated by industry associations representing downstream users. In order to understand what kind of information is to be collected and reported in the use maps, we will take a look in this presentation at the different templates and what kind of information is included in those. The use map concept consists of 4 different templates. One template for use description, the use map format, and 3 additional templates for inputs to the chemical safety assessment for workers, consumer, or environment. The template for the exposure assessment input for workers is called the Sector-Specific Worker Exposure Description, the SWED. For consumer, the Specific Consumer Exposure Determinant, the SCED. And for environment, the Specific Environmental Release Category, the SPERC. So let's look at all these templates and what kind of information they include. But before that, let's take a moment to describe some of the key concepts that are important to be understood when we talk about use maps. Use maps are to be described the typical uses in one sector, and the uses can be included in different life cycle stages. For example, in one sector, we can have uses that correspond to the manufacturing stage, to the formulating stage, or to the consumer stage. Each use consists of contributing activities. When the exposure assessment is to be done per contributing activity, and therefore, the conditions of use that we will describe in the use maps are for each contributing activity in a use. Once we have these concepts clear, let's take a look to the different templates. The first one is the use map format. This is where we will describe the different uses in a sector. The use map format consists in 2 different parts. You see on the screen a yellow part, a green part, and a blue part. The yellow part is the use information. This is where we will describe the uses. The green part is where we will describe the contributing activities for each use. And in the blue part, we will provide additional information that may be of interest for the registrants when they use the use maps. Let's take a look to each different part with an example. Let's focus on the yellow part first, the use information. We see here an example of a sector that has described a professional use of general cleaning products. In this part, we will find the use name, professional use of general cleaning products, the references to the standard phrases that are to be used when we communicate this use name in the supply chain, further description of the use, where we see, for example, that the sector has specified that this regular use of cleaning products involves a spraying application and a wiping using a long-handled tool. The next columns are the market information. In this example, we see that the sector has reported that this use involves product category 35, the washing and cleaning products. The rest of the columns in this part provide additional pieces of information that can be interesting for the registrant. For example, whether this use leads to a subsequent service life. Let's move to the next part, the green part. This is where we define the contributing activities for each use. In our example, the use consists of 3 different activities. So the general use of cleaning products has a manual spraying, a wiping activity, and then the environmental description that describes that it's an indoor use of a solvent or waterborne product. For each contributing activity, we have the type, the contributing activity name, for example, the manual spraying, the reference to the standard phrase that is to be used to communicate this contributing activity name in the supply chain, the corresponding use descriptor. In the example of manual spraying is a process category 11, the PROC 11, and then the reference to the exposure assessment input code. If it's a worker's contributing activity, we will have the reference to a SWED where the conditions of use for the manual spraying will be described. In the blue column, I explained before that we will find additional information. In this column, the sector associations can indicate information that can be interesting for the registrant when they use the use map. For example, which kind of substances are present in the use. If we have a manufacturing of a solvent that is supplying to this sector of use, he can see in this blue column that the solvent is present in this use. He can also see indications of typical concentrations of the substance in the product that he can use when he does the assessment. Other types of information that we can find in this blue column is, for example, tonnage information. If in a sector we have statistics of how big the different uses are in the sector, they can indicate these references, statistics, or additional tonnage information in this column. Any other information that is of interest for registrant can also be included in this column. Now let's move to the first exposure assessment input template, the one for workers, the SWET. So what are the SWETs? We have said already that they describe typical operational conditions and risk management measures for a worker's contributing activity. The SWET includes a template that can be readily incorporated in the registrant chemical safety report as the fields are aligned with Euclid. This facilitates the transfer of information from the sector's use map to the Euclid registration dossier. Using a SWET as input to the assessment ensures that the assessment is realistic and relevant. Further information on SWETs can be found in the ECHA guidance on chemical safety assessment R14. When we take a SWET template, we will find different parts. The first part will include identifiers, characterizing the SWET and explaining the scope. The second part of the SWET is the core of the SWET. They describe the conditions of use to be used as input to an assessment done basically using SETOC TRA tool. An example of a conditions of use that you can find in this SWET is the place of use, whether the use takes place indoor or outdoor. In the next part, we can indicate other conditions of use that are to be used as input to other tools beyond the TRA. Part 4 will indicate whether the contributing activity takes place under rigorous containment. The risk management measures that ensure that rigorous containment is there are to be described in the Part 2 conditions of use. If the sector has measured data that is available for the registrants to be used as input for the assessment, they can also indicate it in the template. Finally, they can indicate additional good practice advice that can be of interest for communicating in the supply chain and is not necessarily input to the exposure assessment. For each condition of use, you can also indicate additional details on this condition of use and the reference to the ESCOM standard phrase that is to be used to communicate this condition of use in the supply chain. Additional examples and field-by-field explanations are also included in the SWET template. Moving on to the consumer's exposure assessment input, the SCEDs. So what are the SCEDs? The specific consumer exposure determinants is a template where you can indicate different conditions of use for the use of consumer products in a particular sector. They are initially foreseen to be used as input to the SETOC TRA and KESAR tools, but it's intention to continue working so that they can be used as input to other consumer models under REACH, such as ConsExpo. Additional information on SCEDs is to be found in the ECHA guidance on CSA R15. What will we find in a SCED? When you look at the SCED, the first part is the SCED characteristics. It's what characterizes the SCEDs in terms of title, the sector association that has generated, or which kind of products are described in this particular SCED. Then you will find common determinants that are typically used as input to consumer exposure assessments, such as how frequent the use takes place or the concentration of the substance in the product. In the SCED, you also find the exposure assessment inputs for the different exposure assessments of dermal, inhalation, of oral. For example, you will find information such as skin contact area, volume swallowed, or place of use, indoor or outdoor, all describing the specific use of a consumer product so that they can be assessed. Finally, we will look at the SPERCs, the exposure assessment input for environment. In a SPERC, we will find the conditions of use, but this time with regards to the environment for a particular activity. The SPERCs also include related release factors that are derived from these conditions of use and explanations on their origin. The development of SPERCs has started already in 2008 and has continued since then under the CSR-ES roadmap. ECHA's Chemical Safety Assessment tool, KESAR, supports the use of SPERCs as input to the specific environmental assessment. Further information on SPERCs can be found in the ECHA guidance on CSA R16. When you open a SPERC, you will find a fact sheet and a background document. A SPERC fact sheet includes the name, the scope and applicability domain, the facts that are to be used for the chemical safety report and for the exposure scenario for communication, explanations, justifications, and references to sources. The background document explains in more detail the products and processes covered and how the release factors have been derived. One SPERC can refer to one or more contributing activities and one or more substance property profiles. Different sectors have opted for different approaches. The data structure of a SPERC includes the identifier, the operational conditions and risk management measures for the particular activity, impacting environmental release, such as how to handle the waste or what kind of risk management measures or treatment processes are on site. The release factors are also defined in the SPERCs for this set of operational conditions. You will find the release factors to air, water, soil, and waste with the corresponding justifications. Release factors sometimes depend on substance properties. That's why you will find sometimes different sets of release factors for the different substances in a use for the same application. Field-by-field explanations and indications of whether the information is to be found in the exposure scenario for communication or not are also found in the SPERC. What is the status of all this work? All the templates and support material has been published on the ECHA website. You see the link on the screen, and I really invite you to have a look to it, to what's available. You will have different variety of approaches depending on sectors, but we really hope that more and more sectors develop use maps using these templates. A workshop was held on the 12th of May to exchange among those active sectors experiences and feedback on this material. The material and report from this workshop will be published very soon on our website. As soon as use maps start to be available, we will host them on our website. There is a pilot project on the use maps under development, and we will report on it very soon. Finally, I would like to conclude with some tips from those sectors that have already generated use maps and wanted to share with those that are planning to work on them. The first one is to collect the information from the sector on conditions of use through questionnaires. The role of industry association is vital in this coordination of these questionnaires and collection of information. The second tip is to involve registrants. Downstream users have definitely a better overview of markets and realistic conditions of use, but open and transparent communication with registrants needs to be there from the beginning to ensure that the outcome is used by them. Finally, this is not an exercise that can be done in one day or 1 week, so reserve enough time in your sector to put in place a process that can collect and report this information and generate the corresponding use maps. Identify companies that can be involved and people that can participate, and document everything that is done. With these tips, I really hope that we will see more and more sectors generating use maps and making use of these templates. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you, Mercedes. My name is Bridget Ginnity and I work in the Risk Management Implementation Unit here at ECHA. You've already heard from Mercedes a lot of detail about the use maps and from Andrew a lot about the benefits. What I'd like to do is to give a picture of how it fits into the general information in the supply chain and how registrants and downstream users are involved in it. First of all, I'll describe about how the use maps fit in with the information that's provided downstream. And there are a lot of actors involved, registrant, downstream users, sector organisations. So to describe a little bit about who does what. Now, all of these activities are really being based on the REACH registration 2018, or certainly one eye is being kept to that. So I'd like to describe a bit about how use maps can make life easier for registrants, and also to look about how KSR can be used. Now, KSR is an IT tool that's developed by ECHA for CSRs, for chemical safety reports. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then also about what the individual downstream users can do to work towards REACH registration 2018. But I'll start with an overview of the key elements that are in the information cycle. Now, first of all, we've talked about use maps. These describe the typical uses in a sector, and they're not for a specific substance. They're describing, for example, how a cleaning agent might be used in an industry or by professional workers, describing how adhesives might be applied. But they're providing the input for the exposure assessment that would be used by the registrant. Another key element that's associated with REACH is the exposure scenario. These are sent together with the safety data sheet to the recipients and provide the advice on the conditions of safe use. And these are for a specific substance because they've been developed by the registrant based on the assessment. Now, and this is the information that goes with substances. And we also have what's called a SUMI, or safe use of mixture information. And I'll elaborate on this a little bit more because it's something you may not be used to. It's really a very recent development. And the background to this is very much, I suppose, the difficulties that were experienced with exposure scenarios over the last few years. People were finding the information difficult to find, that they were getting a large number of pages of exposure scenarios, and that with a mixture you had a lot of different exposure scenarios as well. Now, with a lot of improvements were made in terms of the format of the exposure scenario, the short titles so that a table of contents can be done. So a lot of the finding information within exposure scenario is being improved, and alignment of phrases and so on. But there's also been, with mixtures, you still have the problem if, for example, you had 3 different ingredients in a mixture, would you get exposure scenarios for those 3 different substances? So that obviously isn't the best way. So industry has worked together on developing a SUMI template. And this is really what it looks like. So the template has been agreed, and you can see from looking at it, there are very clear conditions, clear way in which the operational conditions and the risk management measures are shown, and often using pictograms where necessary. The sector organisations would generate these SUMIs for the typical uses that are in their sectors and using sector terminology where necessary. And in many ways, the SUMIs are really the start point to the use maps, because the sector organisations are very much looking at how what chemicals are being used, what products are being used within their sectors and how they're being used, developing SUMIs which describe the safe use of this, and then using those to see what use maps they need to develop to correspond to these SUMIs. So going back to the previous slide, we have the safe use of mixture information provides the advice on conditions of safe use for mixtures used within a sector. These are annexed to safety data sheet for a mixture. So instead of having a large number of different exposure scenarios for the different ingredients, you have typically 2 pages for every main use of that mixture. And they're often the basis for using use maps. On the previous slide, you will see a link to the DUC website, which gives you a guideline and the template for the SUMI. So these are the 3 elements, and I'd like to show where they fit within the information cycle. Andrew had shown this slide before, but I hope now it's pretty obvious to you where the use map, the exposure scenario, and the SUMI will go. So will I give you full marks if you put the use maps here going towards the information to the registrant from Downstream, and then looking at the exposure scenario and the SUMI, going first of all with substances and then with mixtures. We've also developed an infographic that you might find useful. And this, if you click on this on the webinar directly, you'll be able to go to an interactive infographic where you can, in the blue side with the use maps, you can find the individual templates. And then looking at the information downstream, you can see information on the substances. There we have the template for the exposure scenario. We have links to the ESCOM phrase catalogue and also to the ESCOM XML, which is the IT format that is used for communicating exposure scenario information. We have an e-guide which gives very clear description of safety data sheets and exposure scenarios, both for worker level and for the occupational health and safety professional. And then for mixtures, there are 2 elements. This is the template for safe use of mixture information, the SUMI, which I talked about earlier. And now the SUMI won't address every single use. There may be situations where there isn't a SUMI which describes how the mixture is being used. In those cases, the formulator will need to identify the lead component of the ingredients that go into the mixture, and from that identification of the lead component can identify which risk management measures apply in the mixture and communicate them onward using a template similar to the SUMI in all probability. So all of these products have been developed as part of the CSR ES roadmap. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about where the information cycle and really who does what within this cycle. Essentially, we have 3 main players or groups of players. We've got the downstream user sector organisations, the registrants, who can be manufacturers or importers, and the formulators, who are that, if you like, important link in downstream users between the registrants and the end users. Now, the downstream user sector organisations, or it could be individuals, they're the group who generate the use maps and generate the SUMIs for the typical sector uses. And these use maps will be publicly available on ECHA's website. Then, when it comes to the registrants, they select the use maps from the website of those that have been put up there, and then they generate exposure scenarios for their assessment as part of the registration and based on these use maps. After registration, they forward the exposure scenarios down to the formulators. The formulators look at what products they have, select the relevant SUMI for their mixtures, for their products, and then they check that the operational conditions and risk management measures in that SUMI are covered by the exposure scenarios received by the registrant. In theory, and hopefully in practice, we'll see, if the registrant has based it on the use maps, well, then we'll find that the SUMI is also linked. The SUMI and the exposure scenario are linked, and there is no difficulty in ascertaining that the use is covered. There was a workshop in May in Brussels at which a lot of the various groups involved in use maps were gathered, and at that we had some sector organisations, and Leonida Della Pietra from the Fertilisers Association had a quote in which she was giving some advice to downstream user sector associations. She advised that the associations put in place a system to collect the information and to support companies in terms of coordination of the activities and really helping the registrant to base their assessments on realistic scenarios.
Well, first of all, be realistic. Look at the most important issues first. Start to cover, let's say, 80% of all the uses before going in the very difficult nitty-gritties where you have very particular uses. Be realistic in contacting your registrants. Think first, sit together, bundle your information and get then in group in contact with your registrants in order to facilitate this communication. The worst thing that can happen is that every single downstream user is contacting every single manufacturer of that substance. Again, this is indeed one of the reasons why we have been inventing this use maps in order to facilitate a better and streamlined communication in the supply chain.
This is for sector organisations, and I'd mentioned earlier that individuals may sometimes want to generate use maps. The first piece of advice is really try not to do it. You might have to, but really, first of all, see with your sector organisation and really try to encourage them to include your uses if at all possible. It may be that you have an unusual use or your sector organisation is not active in this, and so you would have to generate use maps yourself and provide them to your suppliers. But as much as possible, try to cooperate with others who are active in the area and avoid duplication in this work, maybe other companies or other sector organisations, not directly your own. And then whether you're a sector organisation or an individual, it's very important, I think, in generating use maps that you use the agreed template and the agreed naming conventions and follow the other guidance that it's available on it. Even where you might think there's a better way of doing it, really in many ways the best way is to do it in the aligned and agreed way. If everybody in this supply chain is getting the information in a consistent way, it makes it much easier for them to handle it rather than dealing with different ways from different people. And keep in mind in developing use maps that the information is really going to feed into the exposure scenarios. So really think in terms of the phrases that you need for communication that will give good, useful advice to the downstream users. And these should be standard phrases really as much as possible. Now, it may be that the standard phrases that are there aren't suitable, so work together with the ESCOM phrase group in terms of proposing new standard phrases when that's necessary to do. But here's just an illustration of some phrases that you could use to say, wear suitable gloves. Here I've shown 4 different ways of using it. Now, there's not a huge difference between those 4 different ways. So really, as much as possible, see if phrases that are there are suited to your use. Avoid saying the same thing in slightly different ways. It's much better. It's much easier in terms of translation, in terms of the downstream user understanding what you need when they get it. It is generic, but it can also convey the necessary information most simply. An aspect which I'm sure has come to mind is, where do I find these use maps, or if you're generating them, where do I store them? ECHA has established a section of the website devoted to use maps. At the moment, you can find all of the templates and some examples there. And as soon as the sector organisations finish generating the use maps with their SWEDs, SCEDs and SPERCs, these will all be hosted up on the website as well. So this is very much a one-stop shop for it. As has been said earlier, the use maps are not an innovation this time around. They were actually started back in 2008. And at that time, the use maps were hosted on the individual sector websites, and an overview Excel spreadsheet was hosted by CEFIC, and that is still there, and it can show you what use maps had been used in previous registrations. So that might be interesting to see. But the intention is that all of the new developed use maps will be hosted on the ECHA website. So as I'd said earlier, all of this work and the great activity that's going on is very much with an eye to the REACH 2018 registration. So I'd like to talk a bit about how, in practical terms, the use maps and REACH registration will tie in together. I'll consider it first of all from a registrant viewpoint. How does the registrant go about selecting and using the use maps? Now, there will be this library of use maps on the ECHA website, so the registrant can go through this and select the ones that are most relevant for his particular substance. Now, and this will be based on knowing what the typical uses are of the substance and what sectors that it's used in. So this is, rather than making it up himself, that can be based on the sector information from the use maps. The next step is doing the chemical safety report, the CSR. The use maps can be used to help generate the exposure scenarios that are part of the CSR that the registrant then uses to base the exposure estimate on. When the registration is complete and the registrant is communicating downstream, these exposure scenarios are then communicated downstream. The relevant ones are picked out and the relevant information within it. It's usually not the same full exposure scenario as is in the CSR, but one containing the information that's really useful for the downstream users. Now, ECHA has developed an IT tool called KSAR to help the registrants in preparing a chemical safety report, and the use maps fit well into this system. First of all, when it comes to the use maps, these will be in a format that are available for automatic input to KSAR, so that saves an awful lot of manual work in terms of inputting the life cycle and the uses. When it comes to then making the registrant CSR, again, the exposure scenarios can be generated from this information that was fed from the use maps. And the KSAR includes some exposure estimation tools to estimate the exposure, or else you can input that information from other tools or from measured data. The CSR also incorporates information about the substance property and the hazard assessment. When the registrant has prepared a Euclid dossier, that information can be automatically input from Euclid into the KSAR. So then KSAR takes the hazard assessment, looks at the exposure estimate, and then compares the exposure estimate with the exposure limit values and sees if the risk is controlled. After registration, again, sends the exposure scenario down to the downstream user, and in this case the generation of the exposure scenario is simplified with KSAR by simply ticking which exposure scenarios are relevant, and then within each exposure scenario seeing which information within those is the most useful. Another point in which KSAR makes life easier for the registrant is because now it's necessary to put information on the life cycles and the uses into the Euclid dossier. This information has been part of the CSR and so can be automatically, the relevant sections in Euclid can be automatically filled from KSR. So you can see that this integration really facilitates the ease of doing the CSR, and also if there's any updates necessary, it makes the whole process an awful lot simpler. So with downstream users, what are the main considerations with respect to registration 2018? Again, the main thing really is to check that your uses are covered in the registration. Are sector organisations preparing use maps, and do they cover your use? Again, I refer to the workshop we had in May, and also Greta Puska from Yara was present at that, and she described very much the problems that they've had in the past with not having their uses covered in exposure scenario, and that leading to an awful lot of difficulty in terms of communicating with suppliers. So she strongly advises downstream users to join forces and start creating sector use maps, and really believes that we'll get better exposure scenario and avoid lots of correspondence later on if everything is sorted out from the beginning. Now, I know when we talk about Reg 2018 and downstream users, a question that will really come to the mind of an awful lot is, okay, uses being covered is one aspect, but another thing is your substances. And will those substances that are critical to your business be covered? And it's slightly off the topic of this webinar, but I think it's probably worth just making a few key points to consider to make sure that substances that are critical to your business are registered. Obviously, the first part is to really look at what you use and see what's critical. And it's not just substances, but maybe things that you are supplied, be it articles or other mixtures, and maybe not substances that you use directly. You then need to check if they're going to be registered by your suppliers or by other suppliers. And if you don't get assurances that the substance will be registered, maybe you need to consider that you can import it directly. If you're importing more than 1 ton per year, well then you'll have to consider registration. But it's a lower, if the volume is less than 10 tons per year, the registration requirements are less. We're recently updating our website, and you'll find that there's more advice specifically on downstream users and REACH registration 2018 if you'd like to have a look at this, if this is an issue to you. So, but going back to the main theme of the webinar here, which is on the use maps and seeing how use maps can improve the information in the supply chain. I'd really like to emphasize that I think a lot of the work that's being done now will have a strong influence on the information supply chain in the years to come, in many years to come. It may in some ways be looked back on in the same way as safety data sheets were an innovation decades ago and are a core part of how information on safe use is communicated. We may be saying the same about exposure scenarios and SUMIs in decades to come. So in doing this, every registrants, downstream users and sector organisations all have a role to play, as indeed do ECHA and the member state organisations. We all have a serious interest in this working and working well. Now, and many of you are downstream users and individuals, and just if you're in that position, there are some steps that you can take and not necessarily leave it to the larger organisations. Really contacting your sector organisations about use maps, showing them that you believe in this system and that you want to make sure that your uses are covered. The same with your supplier, encouraging them to use use maps in their registration so that your uses are covered properly in it. And perhaps you can actually help with your sector organisation in terms of generating the use maps. So regardless of what position you're in this, I'd really encourage you to be active and to support the work that's going on in whatever way that you can. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I will pass you over now to Andrew to give some concluding words for this webinar. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Let's spend a few moments to remind you on some key points that you've heard today. Use maps help registrants and downstream users alike with structured, realistic information on use and exposure. The tools to help you are now available. Some industry sectors representing downstream users have started to develop or update their use maps. First, Registrants have committed to use them for the 2018 registrations. The next phase of ECHA's Reach 2018 campaign concerns the assessment of hazard and risk, for which compiling information on uses is an important part. There will be an ECHA webinar on assessing hazard and risk on the 20th of July. Details are on ECHA's website. So, investigate what's going on in your sector. Contact your sector association to find out if they have a use map that you can take advantage of, or if they intend to prepare one. ECHA also plans to make sector use maps available on its website. Finally, you can find more information at the link shown on the screen. You will also be interested to know that later this month we will have brand new Downstream user web pages on ECHA's website. There will also be a new logo to easily identify Downstream user content on our web pages and publications. A LinkedIn showcase page for Downstream users with tips, news, events and supporting material will also become available. We're reaching the end of our webinar. Remember that you still have 30 minutes to send questions to our panelists. When the webinar closes, you will be automatically directed to a short satisfactory survey. Your comments and suggestions will help us to further improve our webinars. The webinar will be recorded and published on our website shortly after the event. All registered participants will receive a link to the recording and presentations as soon as they are available. We will also gather the main questions and answers and send them to you shortly after the event. Our next webinar will take place on the 21st of June, getting familiar with the new Chemical Safety Assessment and Reporting Tool, CASAR. The webinar introduces you to the new version of the Chemical Safety Assessment and Reporting Tool, CASAR 3. It is mainly targeted to those who are not yet familiar with the tool, but is also useful for those who want to learn more about the changes between CASAR version 2 and CASAR version 3. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you again in our upcoming webinars.